Hey guys, that's right here, and welcome back to another Clash Royale video. Now the meta in Clash Royale is currently quite interesting, with a ton of Goblin Giants, Royal Giants, and Lava Hounds running absolutely rampant. And, you know, sometimes you might get a little bit tired of facing those decks over and over and over. So today, I'm going to be going over 5 off-meta deck combinations that actually do surprisingly well in this current meta. These are decks that I see do consistently well in grand challenges and on top ladder, and due to the fact that a lot of them have some unexpected combinations, can oftentimes give you the edge in terms of surprising the opponents. With each deck, I'm going to be going over the strategies and synergies that are involved in playing the deck effectively, and of course a deck link is going to be down in the description for those of you that are interested. And while you're down there, if you guys are interested in playing World War Doe with me, I will have a link down in the description where you can join my clan 69 Doe. World War Doe just released a Heroes update which does introduce a lot of fun and new mechanics, so if you're interested, of course the link is down below. Anyways, with all that out of the way, let's get right into the decks. Number 1, Balloon Freeze. Now this is a balloon deck that has been around the game for a long time, but in this meta, it's actually very effective at countering some of the most popular decks. Of course, this balloon deck is on the expensive side, so the playstyle is going to be more control based, being more reactive, and playing more defensively based on what your opponents play. Starting out the match, I usually will not make the first move, but if the opponent really is going to wait, then you can maybe cycle one of your air counters or a bar barrel at the bridge. After that, you're going to want to try and identify proper moments to go in with the balloon. For the most part, there are 2 main situations. The first situation is if the opponent makes a big commitment or places one of their air counters in the back. This way you know that they're low on elixir or they won't have sufficient air defense to defend your balloon pushes, and this will allow you to make a quick balloon lumberjack or balloon bar barrel push in the opposite lane. The second situation is off of a counter push. This deck is very heavily focused on control, and a lot of the units in this deck are quite tanky, meaning that oftentimes you'll have a counter push surviving after a defense. If you have that elixir, go ahead and support a balloon and apply even more pressure to your opponents. Now let's go ahead and talk about that strong defense. Baby Dragon and Bowler are very effective at dealing with both swarms as well as tanks, and are both extremely tanky units themselves. Inferno Dragon and Lumberjack are going to be your 2 tank damagers, and so you're really going to want to make sure you have at least one of those in cycle if you are against a more expensive beatdown style deck. Bar Barrel is down to help cycle, and the NATO is pretty useful just all around the board on both offense as well as on defense. Last but not least, the Freeze is an insanely underrated defensive tool, and especially combined with things such as the Baby Dragon, the Inferno Dragon, and the Bowler, can buy your troops a super important 4 or 5 seconds where the opponent simply cannot do anything since their offensive push is completely frozen. The Freeze can also be used on offense. I mean, this is pretty self-explanatory, but just make sure you're not being over aggressive with that Freeze. This deck does not have a big spell, so make sure that you always finish off a tower before really moving on to the next one. The last thing you want is to lose a match because you accidentally left a tower at like 100 hit points and you just simply do not have that spell power to take it down. Number 2, Giant Skeleton Graveyard. Now, Graveyard has seen a bit of a decrease in popularity in this month simply because of the nerf that it received. That being said, this variation of Graveyard is definitely one that players might not expect and can definitely catch your opponents off guard. Just like that previous deck, this is a control deck, meaning that you're going to play more reactively and focus on defending what your opponents play. Starting off the match, I will play a little bit more chill, maybe cycling a bar barrel or a fisherman in the back. I generally will not cycle my air counter just in case the opponents happen to be running an air heavy deck. After that, I would recommend playing this deck extremely reactively. Just go ahead and defend whatever your opponents have, and if your opponents make a big commitment in the back or if you have a big counter push, then you can go ahead and support a quick graveyard push. On the defensive end, of course, you have that classic hunter fisherman combo that is just so effective at dealing with tanks and swarms alike. E-Wiz is there to reset Inferno Dragons as well as deal a little bit of splash control, and the Dark Prince is going to be your main mini tank that you're going to rely on during this match. The Giant Skeleton is an extremely effective lane clogger, but it is 6 elixir, so you will have to carefully manage your elixir counts when you're going to play that card. That being said, the Giant Skeleton is extremely tanky, and so if it does survive a defense, you're going to have yourself an extremely nice tank for a counter pushing graveyard. Now, there are a couple ways that I will go in with graveyards. The first is, of course, off of a counter push. Supporting a graveyard paired with those surviving units can be extremely deadly and force your opponents into an extremely uncomfortable position. However, towards double elixir time, and if you're against a cheaper deck, you might also want to consider building up a big push like a beatdown style deck, going with a giant skeleton in the back, supporting it with your other units, and then going in with a graveyard once that push crosses the bridge. Sometimes that'll be the only way that you're able to power through your opponent's defenses, so make sure that you're vigilant about the matchup to determine which of these strategies you're going to mostly rely on. Number 3. Golem Balloon Clone. Now, this is an extremely wacky deck. You might not have seen it before, or you might have, but it's an extremely off-meta, unexpected combination that kinda is a hybrid of two different decks, Golem Beatdown and Balloon Cycle. Taking a look at the deck, it's extremely expensive, and it's an obvious beatdown deck, so you're going to play this like a pretty much all or nothing deck. Starting off the match, you don't make the first move. Straight up, do not make the first move. If your opponents aren't going to do anything, just wait until double elixir time. That'll give you a much easier time because this deck is just so expensive. But if your opponents just even make a slight commitment in the back, this is definitely a Golem first play. Sack an entire tower to go in for a big beatdown push type deck. So if the opponent goes with something in the back and you do have the Golem in your hand, then you can just straight up play that Golem first play, no big deal. Even if you lose an entire tower, the offense with this deck is just so unstoppable. With the Night Witch, the Electro Dragon, the Lumberjack, as well as that Balloon, it's just such a difficult combination for your opponents to stop. That being said, one thing that you really have to watch out for is the opponent's big spells. When playing this deck, you have to be very cognizant of what spells your opponents have and whether or not they have it in cycle. For example, if the opponents have a rocket, then you absolutely do not want to group your units together, and if they have a tornado, then you're going to make sure that you force out the tornado before you go in with the clone. Now, even though this deck is pretty much focused on offense, there are still pretty solid defensive options. Night Witch and Electro Dragon are going to be your main air defenders, and they are quite effective at that. Lumberjack and Skeleton Army are going to be your main tank defenders, and of course you have that clone spell, which can occasionally be used on defense. All in all, it's a pretty simple deck to play, but you do have to be quite careful because it requires you to be very smart in terms of min-maxing your gameplay, taking tower damage in order to build up a big push on your own end. Number 4. 2.6 Mortar Cycle. Now this is probably the hardest deck that I will share in today's episode. The 2.6 Mortar Cycle deck is one that has gotten a little bit more popular in this current meta, and it does actually do surprisingly well. Now this is a quick, aggressive, chip style deck. So starting out the match, always cycle some of your cards. Cycle your Log, Skeletons, Spear Goblins to get some chip damage, and you can occasionally even cycle an Earthquake if you're sure the opponent isn't running a heavy building. Now the goal in this matchup is to maintain a high pressure all the time so your opponent simply cannot build up a big push of their own. You can also go aggressive with mortars, and that'll oftentimes get your opponents to play down some of their big tanks and force you on the defensive end. On the defensive end, this deck requires a lot of micromanagement. The Firecracker is probably your most important defensive option, dealing ranged splash damage that can also take out supporting units behind a tank. Therefore, on a defense, you're gonna really want to focus on protecting that Firecracker and also cycling to a second Firecracker to assist. The Knights can do a great job at protecting the Firecrackers, and then the Skeletons and the Spear Goblins can serve as a bit of spell bait as well as cycle potential. Last but not least, the Tornado synergizes extremely well in this deck, not only with the Firecracker but also with the Mortar, being able to tornado troops out of range of the Mortar or even tornadoing troops into that King Tower for a King Tower activation. Now in terms of finishing off matches, well, you have a couple of options. The first is of course with the Mortar. The Mortar can occasionally get a couple of chip shots onto the tower, and by playing the Mortar in the center, you can oftentimes play defense and offense at the exact same time. However, more often than not, the way you're going to finish off matches is with Spell Cycle. With the speed that this deck cycles, and given the spell power contained inside of this deck, you can easily take off 500-600 damage off an opponent's tower in double or triple elixir time, even at a tournament standard level. All in all, as long as you're applying that high pressure and forcing your opponents to constantly be on that defensive end, you're going to eventually chip that tower down to spell range. Number 5, Executioner Balloon Cycle. Now this is a deck that is honestly quite classic, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen similar variants of Balloon. However, it's not as popular of a variant, and I truly think that it is quite an underrated deck. Now just like the previous deck, it is also a quick cycle deck, so you're going to be wanting to apply a bit of a higher pressure throughout this match. Starting off, you can cycle a Miner, there's Skeletons, a Zap, or even an Ice Spirit to try and get some initial chip damage while forcing out a response from your opponent. After that, just like the previous balloon decks, you're going to want to identify the proper times to go in on offense with the balloon, when your opponents make a big elixir commitment or when they waste their air counters and they're out of cycle. In terms of supporting the balloon push, a Miner, Ice Spirit, and Zap are all extremely effective ways of taking out the opponent's units and distracting the opponent's towers, and in some instances, you can even use the Tornado to pull your opponent's air defenses away from that balloon. Again, this is another deck that does not actually have a big spell, so in terms of finishing the match off, you're going to want to be able to consistently either get balloon death damage or be able to consistently get Miner chip damage onto the opponent's tower. On the defensive end of this deck, it relies exclusively on 3 cards: the Executioner, the Valkyrie, and the Tornado. The Executioner is of course the way you're going to deal with big massive pushes, with that blade being able to cut through an entire push. Combining that with the NATO can get you so much value at taking out opposing units. In addition, the Valkyrie can provide both tankage, splash damage, as well as high damage output, making for an extremely valuable support card that you're going to pretty much always want to save on a defense. All of these units have relatively high HP, allowing for high potential to support a balloon with on a counter push. Essentially, as long as you're playing this deck a little bit more on the quick side and you're constantly always aiming for chip damage over and over onto the tower, you'll eventually be able to chip your opponent's tower down and, if anything, win in that tiebreaker victory. So there we go, those are the top 5 off-meta decks that counter this month's meta. Some of these are actually quite wacky and really do change up your gameplay, so if you're looking for something super duper fresh, maybe picking up one of these decks is definitely a solid move. Of course, deck links are going to be down below for those of you that are interested, but unfortunately guys, that's all I've got time for in today's episode. Huge thanks to all of my channel members, you guys are the absolute G's. If you enjoyed, please leave a like down below as well as a subscription to my channel, and as always, this is Legendaray, and I'm signing off. See you guys next time.